The Kansas sun hadn't yet burned away the early mist as Grace Whitaker leaned against the dented hood of her old Ford pickup, her eyes fixed on the stretch of sunflower fields, rippling gently in the breeze. The flowers had bloomed defiantly this season, their golden heads turned skyward, despite the parched soil below. But even their resilience couldn't soothe the knot tightening in her stomach. A certified letter had arrived the day before, its government-issued seal coldly official. Inside, a foreclosure notice, stamped and dated, informed her that unless she paid the full balance of the farm loan within 30 days, Whitaker Farms, all 240 acres of it, would be reclaimed by First Valley Bank. The interest rate, which had quietly ballooned over the last year, now loomed like a guillotine. Grace had known this day might come, but knowing didn't soften the blow. The farm had been in her family for 4 generations, established by her great-grandfather during the Dust Bowl era. Losing it wasn't just financial ruin, it was erasure. Her daughter, Mia, had always understood that, even when she chose to study environmental science instead of agriculture. That morning, Grace didn't expect company, but the crunch of gravel behind her pulled her from her thoughts. "Mom," Mia called as she climbed out of a faded blue sedan, a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. "I drove straight through. Couldn't sleep after you called." Grace met her halfway with a hug that lingered longer than either of them expected. "You didn't have to come so fast." Mia pulled back and looked her mother in the eye. "Yes, I did. And I brought something." Inside the kitchen, where a stack of unpaid bills leaned dangerously on the counter, Mia spread out a series of printed maps and data sheets. "This is from the university archives," she said, tapping one sheet. "A hydrographic survey from 1978. And this," she pointed to another newer map, "is the current irrigation district overlay." Grace squinted at the pages. So our property sits right on top of a Class B aquifer nexus, a major one. It means the land under our feet channels water to most of the eastern farms in Riverbend. But look at this. We're not even on the irrigation district map anymore. It's like they wiped us off. Grace's jaw clenched. That can't be right. I checked 3 different sources. It is. Someone either made a mistake or... Mia hesitated. Or what? Or they deliberately removed us to restrict our access. And that foreclosure, if we can't prove our water rights, it's just a matter of time before they move in. Grace folded the papers with more force than necessary. "I'm going to the hearing tomorrow." "The land board hearing?" She nodded. "If they want to take this farm, they're going to have to do it in front of the entire damn county." The next morning, Grace arrived at the county courthouse in her best pair of jeans and a sun-bleached flannel shirt. She wore her boots like armor and her silence like a sharpened blade. Mia walked beside her, clutching the folder of maps and data like it was dynamite. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was stifling. Developers in tailored suits filled the front rows, their tablets glowing and styluses twitching. Grace recognized one of them, a man named Vaughn from Sterling Horizons, the development firm buying up farmland across Riverbend. At the registration desk, a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up. "Name?" "Grace Whitaker. I'm here to speak on record about the Whitaker farm property." The clerk tapped a few keys. "You're not on the speaker list." "I filed my request last week," Grace said firmly. "The list closed Monday. You can submit a written statement, but you won't be allowed to address the board." Mia stepped forward. "You can't be serious. That policy was changed without public notice." The clerk shrugged. "That's the rule now. Sorry." As they walked toward the back of the chamber, Grace muttered, "They're trying to shut us out." "Looks like it." They sat through hours of mundane proceedings, listening to zoning amendments and parcel number shifts, their nerves coiling tighter with each passing minute. When the Whitaker farm docket finally appeared, Grace gripped Mia's hand. Just as the board chair began to speak, a low, distant thrum grew louder. Heads turned as the sound intensified. Grace stepped outside, shading her eyes as a helicopter descended, whipping dust and pollen into the air. Painted in dark navy, with the state seal emblazoned across the side, it landed directly on the western edge of Grace's sunflower field. From within, a team of suited staffers stepped out, followed by a woman in a tailored blazer, Governor Evelyn Grant herself. She walked toward Grace with determined steps, a folder clutched in her hand. "Ms. Whitaker," she said, her voice raised over the rotors. "We need to talk. Right now." Grace blinked. "About what?" The governor opened the folder just enough for Grace to see the bold letters stamped across the top, Classified Environmental Risk Report. And beneath it, a single line, redacted save for 3 words, Whitaker Aquifer Nexus. And in that instant, Grace knew, the battle for her farm had just become a war for the truth. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth as Grace Whitaker led a cautious entourage of state officials through the West Field. The air held a strange stillness, the kind that followed a storm long overdue. Governor Evelyn Grant, flanked by 2 aides, stayed close behind her, trying not to trip over the uneven rows of hardened soil. Even in her tailored blazer and polished boots, the governor looked oddly out of place in a land that had been farmed by calloused hands for 4 generations. "Here," Grace said, stopping beside a rusted metal cap, half buried beneath dry weeds. She kicked away a layer of brittle dirt, revealing the seal of the Kansas Department of Agriculture. "This was our primary irrigation well, shut off without notice 3 years ago. No hearing, no explanation, just gone." Governor Grant crouched carefully, brushing her fingers over the metal. "And no response from the county since then?" she asked. Grace shook her head. "We've filed 6 petitions, all denied or ignored. They say we're no longer within an active irrigation zone, even though every hydrologic survey for the last 40 years says otherwise." Behind them, Mia handed a thick binder to Ethan Callahan, who had just arrived from the university, khakis stained from the field, sleeves rolled up, a man clearly more comfortable in boots than at a faculty meeting. He flipped through the documents quickly, then looked up, jaw tightening. "This is bad," he muttered. "These readings match the ones we found near Oak Hollow before that land got seized. The water's being diverted, not evaporating." The governor stood. "Diverted where?" Ethan turned to Mia, who stepped forward. "We think toward the Ridge Creek development, 20 miles southeast. But the county maps have been scrubbed. I've compared satellite imagery from the past 5 years with archived hydrology data. There's a gap, one big enough to hide a whole network of underground channels." Grace nodded. "We had a wet spring 2 years back. Our land stayed dry. But that new golf course 20 miles away? Lush and green like Eden." Governor Grant's eyes darkened. "And nobody's raised hell about this until now?" "Some have tried," said a new voice. They turned to see a woman approaching from the road, jeans, notebook, camera slung across her chest. Rachel Vaughn, reporter from the Kansas Tribune, known for digging into places polite journalists avoided. "Grace Whitaker?" Rachel extended a hand. "I've spoken with 4 other farmers in Riverbend County who've experienced nearly identical shutdowns, wells capped, permits revoked, all quietly, all without due process." Grace eyed her warily. "And you're just now showing up?" Rachel shrugged. "No one talks unless they're desperate. And you, Miss Whitaker, just brought the governor to a dried-up field. That screams desperation and truth." Mia stepped closer. "What do you know about Sterling Horizons?" Rachel's lips tightened. "More than I can print without getting sued. I've got records that show campaign donations from Blake Kavanaugh's shell companies to at least 3 sitting commissioners. That's not a coincidence." Ethan pulled a folded paper from his satchel. "And this map isn't supposed to exist." He spread out a faded, water-stained sheet on the back of Grace's pickup. The 1982 hydrological map of Riverbend County. Clearly marked were the old aquifers, including one running directly beneath Grace's land. "This document was removed from the public archives in 2005, Ethan said. Mia found a copy in a geology professor's private collection. The lines on the map painted a damning picture, a natural convergence point, an underground vein of water threading through Grace's farm, had been quietly reclassified as inactive. Governor Grant studied the map. "This area was once a priority irrigation zone. What happened?" Rachel tapped the upper right corner, where a new zoning overlay had been added in red ink. "Blake Kavanaugh happened. Right after Sterling Horizons bought land downstream, this region was reevaluated, conveniently drying up any competition." A crackle on a nearby radio caught their attention. One of the governor's aides whispered into his collar, nodding. "Governor, we're being monitored," he said quietly. Grace's spine stiffened. "How?" "Court staff just logged an inquiry into this site's land survey from the clerk's office. Someone inside is watching every move." Ethan exhaled slowly. That would explain why every petition Grace filed was dead on arrival. Someone's running interference. Rachel scribbled a note. "You said your loan came from Plains Horizon Bank?" "Yes," Grace answered. "They raised our interest rate 6 times in 24 months. Said our collateral was degrading." Rachel glanced up. "Blake Kavanaugh sits on their advisory board." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the brittle sunflower stalks like whispers in a church. Grace looked at the governor. "Now, do you understand why I couldn't just walk away quietly?" Governor Grant met her eyes. "Yes, and I want every document you have, every water reading, every permit rejection. We're going to get to the bottom of this." As they turned back toward the farmhouse, a dark SUV idled near the property gate. The windows were tinted, and no one stepped out. Grace narrowed her eyes. "That's not local." Mia pulled her phone, snapping a quick photo. Ethan put a hand on Grace's shoulder. "This is bigger than we thought. If they're watching, they're worried." Grace stared at the silent vehicle as it turned and drove off without a sound. "Good," she whispered. "Let them be. It means they know what's coming." What was buried beneath the soil of Riverbend wasn't just water. It was truth, and Grace Whitaker had just started digging. The late summer sun beat down on Riverbend with an intensity that made everything feel brittle and dry. The kind of dry that seeped into the bones, into the land, and into the trust between neighbors. Grace Whitaker sat across from Sheriff Don Mercer at a rusted metal table in the back office of the county courthouse, sipping lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt paper. They were reviewing property zoning files. Well, at least what was left of them. "Funny thing is," Mercer muttered, flipping through a stack of documents, "this water zoning map here doesn't. See this corner, where your land used to be marked as high access? It's been edited, no record of a hearing, no signatures either. Just updated, quietly." Grace's fingers tightened around the mug. "When did that happen?" "Looks like 2 years ago, right around when your well output started dropping off." "So someone just changed it without telling any of us?" Mercer gave a half shrug. "Could have been a clerical error, or it could have been deliberate. I wouldn't have even noticed it if I hadn't been digging into old survey maps from my first term." Grace didn't respond. Her thoughts spiraled as she stared at the grainy photocopy on the table, the bold black lines rerouting her family's future with silent authority. That evening, Rachel Vaughn knocked on the screen door of the farmhouse, holding a manila folder. "You got a minute?" Grace nodded, letting the reporter inside. Rachel placed the folder on the table and flipped it open, revealing a photo of a woman in her 60s with graying red hair and a serious expression. "Her name's Janice Kellner. Used to work in the Department of Natural Resources. She retired 5 years ago. I tracked her down in Topeka." "What did she say?" "That she resigned after being asked to reclassify aquifer zones without scientific review. She believes multiple county zoning updates were pushed through under the table. She's willing to testify." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Testify to what, exactly?" "That someone inside the DNR coordinated with local officials to make sure land like yours, strategically located farmland, was denied access to water, making it easier to force sales." Grace leaned back, her jaw set. "Who's behind it?" Rachel pulled out a second folder. Inside was a digitally restored document, a scan of a partially shredded memo reassembled from a hard drive image. On it, 3 names stood out: Blake Kavanaugh and 2 members of the county zoning board, Barbara Flint and Rick Donovan. "This came from Janice's personal files," Rachel said. "It was part of a data recovery she commissioned privately after she left. The original documents were destroyed, but fragments survived on her old work laptop." Grace stared at the names. Kavanaugh. Of course. The same man who'd sat smugly in the courtroom last week, pretending to care about Riverbend. The next day, Mia called from her makeshift lab in the barn. She'd been running comparative satellite data provided by Professor Callahan. Mom, you've got to see this, she said, leading Grace over to her laptop. On screen was a color-coded heat map. This shows moisture levels over the past 5 years. Our land and 5 other farms dropped dramatically. But look here. She pointed to a bright green parcel. That land was bought by Sterling Horizons in 2021. Look at the spike in moisture retention just months after they purchased it. Grace frowned. So while we were drying out, they were flourishing. Mia nodded. And that same pattern follows across every acquisition Sterling's made in the past 4 years. Grace exhaled slowly. It's not just neglect. It's strategy. That night, the house was quiet. The kind of silence that sets your skin on edge. Grace sat in the kitchen alone, reviewing the documents Rachel had left behind. Just as the clock ticked past midnight, the phone rang. Whitaker residence, she answered, voice cautious. There was a pause, then a voice distorted by static. Stop digging. For your daughter's sake. The line went dead. Grace stared at the receiver, the blood draining from her face. She reached for her phone and called Mercer. Don, someone just threatened Mia. There was silence on the other end before the sheriff replied. Lock the doors. I'm on my way. Outside, the wind picked up, kicking dust across the sunflowers, their heads bent under the weight of the dry air. Grace stood at the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass, sharp and unwavering. Someone wanted her to quit, but they clearly didn't know her at all, because if there was one thing Grace Whitaker had never done in her life, it was back down. The moon hung low over Riverbend, cloaked in a hazy veil of autumn clouds. The air was still, thick with the kind of tension that made every gust of wind feel like it carried secrets. Grace stood on her porch, her fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, gone cold. From the edge of the field, a pickup rumbled to life and disappeared into the gravel road without headlights. She'd seen that truck parked just off the property line for 3 nights now. Inside, the house was quiet. Mia was in her room, headphones on, staring into her laptop, eyes red-rimmed from hours of reviewing satellite data. Grace had barely slept since the anonymous call warning her to back off for your daughter's sake. But fear hadn't steered her away, it had only sharpened her instincts. Tonight, something was moving beneath the surface, and she could feel it like a pressure behind her eyes. 2 miles away, in the dim back room of a shuttered grain co-op near the edge of town, 4 men sat around a folding table under the dull flicker of fluorescent light. A Sterling Horizons regional director shuffled papers in front of the county zoning commissioner and 2 land use attorneys. The mood was tight. We have 1 week, the director muttered, tapping a document marked Restricted Environmental Review. If this leaks, we lose more than just Riverbend. Outside, crouched behind a rusted feed bin, Rachel Vaughn adjusted the microphone wired beneath her jacket. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from adrenaline. The same source had tipped her off. A private meeting, hush-hush, with something too sensitive to leave to email. She hadn't come alone. Her dash cam was running in the car, and a backup recording device was stashed in her thermos. She whispered into her mic, Operations live. Targets in view. Audio is clear. Back on the Whitaker farm, Ethan arrived unannounced, headlights off, headlights out, and boots dusty from a 2-hour hike through riverbed trails. He'd found something. Grace, he said in a low voice at the door, you need to see this. In the kitchen, he unrolled a topographical printout onto the table, older than anything Mia had pulled so far. The lines traced a familiar ridge, but with a strange anomaly, a waterway that no longer existed. There's a buried culvert here, Ethan said. And this? He pointed to an unnatural mound of compacted soil. Sterling covered it with landfill 6 months ago. There's an entire channel running beneath it. Mia joined them, clutching her phone. You're not going to believe this, she said, flipping the screen toward them. A heat map pulsed in red across one of the parcels, adjacent to their land that had been sold off to Sterling in a fire sale last spring. This water signature? It spiked 12 hours ago. Someone's pumping groundwater and redirecting it. But it's not going to agriculture. It's flowing into engineered retention basins, artificial lakes. Decorative, Ethan murmured bitterly, for their model homes. This isn't just theft. It's misdirection on a massive scale. Grace didn't speak. She simply walked to her desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and retrieved a weatherproof USB. She handed it to Ethan. Encrypted, all of Mia's files, the satellite overlays, the soil samples, the transcript of the foreclosure threats. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. I want you to give this to your contact, the one you mentioned in Topeka. Ethan nodded. He's a ghost, but he's trustworthy. At the co-op, the conversation inside grew heated. One of the lawyers raised his voice. The governor's office is sniffing around. Vaughn's asking questions. That girl from the university, Mia, she's pulling data they shouldn't have access to. The Sterling rep leaned in, lowering his voice. If the girl disappears from the narrative, the story dies. It always does. This isn't the first town we've flipped, and it won't be the last. Rachel's breath caught. Her thumb hovered over the emergency signal on her phone. But before she could tap it, the door creaked open behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Just wind. But when she turned back, a light inside the room flicked off. Chairs scraped. Someone was coming. She bolted into the shadows, ducking between tractors and feed bins, heart hammering. In the distance, her car sat like a lifeline. She reached it, slid inside, locked the doors, and backed away slowly. Once on the main road, she hit the gas and called Grace. I have proof, Rachel said. They're faking the environmental assessments. They know about Mia, and they're planning something. The following morning, as the sun fought its way through a curtain of clouds, Grace stood by the ridge Ethan had marked the night before. Mia was 20 yards ahead, holding her drone controller. The little device lifted into the sky, slicing through the mist. 3, 2, now, Mia said, hitting record. The drone camera fed live footage to a monitor strapped to her arm. Below, half-buried PVC piping curved from the base of the hill to a freshly landscaped field lined with ornamental trees. And there it was, a valve hissing open. Water surged, unnaturally clear and full, into a pond with floating benches and faux boulders. She got it. They had it all on camera now. That night, Grace sent a second encrypted drive through courier to the anonymous lawyer Ethan had spoken of. No names, just a return address, a P.O. box in Wichita, and a single line written in her own hand. If anything happens to me or my daughter, go public. She sealed it, lit the stove, and stared into the flame. No more retreat. The moment had come. The war for water had gone silent far too long. Now it would speak. The rain came without warning. Thunder rolled across the flatlands of Riverbend like distant drums in a forgotten war. Grace stood under the porch's rusted tin awning, arms crossed, watching fat drops pummel the dust outside. After months of drought, the sky had finally broken open, but it didn't feel like salvation. The rain hit the ground with force, kicking up plumes of steam, and slid off like water on waxed glass. Mia ran barefoot onto the edge of the field, hands stretched toward the heavens, laughing for a moment, until she noticed something strange. The soil didn't absorb a thing. Puddles formed instantly and sat there, motionless, like the land itself had turned against them. Grace walked out to meet her, crouched, and scooped a palmful of dirt. It was unnaturally smooth, almost greasy to the touch. She let the clump fall from her hand. It slid off like wet chalk. Something was wrong. Within hours, the independent engineering team summoned by Governor Grant arrived in faded blue coveralls, their equipment packed into an old state university van. Ethan, soaked but energized, met them near the western field. Run your hydrophobicity tests, he told them, tapping the surface with his boot. We've got something off pattern here. This isn't drought damage, it's intentional. Mia handed over her preliminary analysis from the previous month. Moisture absorption rates, soil temperatures, chemical traces. And within 30 minutes, the verdict was clear. The land had been chemically treated with a polymer compound designed to repel water, a synthetic siloxane barrier rarely used outside large-scale construction projects. Grace stared at the engineers, the words barely registering. You're saying someone coated my land like a damn parking lot? Exactly, one of them said quietly. It's designed to look natural, but rainwater won't penetrate. Not for weeks, maybe months, unless we chemically break it down. As the news broke, Rachel Vaughn was already preparing her first article. She had everything she needed: quotes, soil analysis reports, aerial comparisons, and her lead paragraph cut straight through the noise. While Riverbend farmers pray for rain, one mother's field is repelling it by design, and the fingerprints of power are all over the chemical trail. The story hit the Kansas Tribune website like a lightning strike. Within 6 hours, the article had been syndicated across state news networks. Grace's face, weathered and sharp-eyed, appeared in every headline. Some outlets called her a whistleblower, others a stubborn relic resisting progress. But the story was out. And that's when the counterattack began. By morning, Sterling Horizons launched a well-oiled PR campaign, painting Grace not as a protector of heritage, but as an obstacle to opportunity. Their press release hit inboxes like a precision strike. In a region desperate for growth, Ms. Whitaker continues to obstruct plans that would bring jobs, housing, and clean infrastructure to Riverbend. A glossy video followed, narrated by a smooth male voice over sweeping drone footage of their pristine developments. "Progress only happens when we clear the path," the narrator said, pausing over slow-motion images of construction workers and children playing in model neighborhoods. "Don't let one voice silence an entire county's future." The phone calls started within hours. Local talk radio lit up with callers both sympathetic and furious. Some applauded Grace. Others accused her of holding back Riverbend with her romantic nostalgia. The public was divided, exactly how Blake Kavanaugh wanted it. Inside the farmhouse, Grace sat with her laptop open, reading one hostile comment after another. "Maybe she just wants to keep all the water for herself," one read. Another, "If your farm's failing, sell it and move on." That's how the market works. She felt her stomach tighten. Mia reached over and closed the screen. "They're trying to drown you in noise, Mom, but it means we're hitting a nerve." Outside, the rain still fell, but it didn't matter. Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled up the gravel road. Governor Grant stepped out, boots splashing into a shallow puddle. She looked grimmer than usual, flanked by a new aide holding a thin binder marked "Confidential Interagency Mandate." "We're done dancing," she told Grace. "As of today, I'm authorizing a joint task force. EPA, State Water Board, Department of Agriculture, and our internal audit team. Full access. No restrictions." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Even into county files?" Grant nodded. "We'll be walking through doors they thought were sealed shut." The governor took a long look at the horizon. Dark clouds still hanging, fields glistening but barren. "This was supposed to be a good rain," she said quietly. "I hate that it wasn't." Grace stood beside her, the two women shoulder to shoulder under the downpour, silent for a long while. Then Grace spoke. "I'm not just fighting for my land anymore," she said. "I'm fighting for every farmer too tired to lift their head after one more betrayal." That night, a strange quiet fell over the fields. The frogs didn't croak. The wind didn't stir. Grace sat at the edge of the bed, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the window. In the distance, the floodlights on Sterling's newly acquired property flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows across the landscape. But she didn't flinch. Not anymore. And while the storm outside had passed, a different kind of storm was just beginning. The storm rolled in just before dawn, not with the thunderous dramatics of a summer squall, but with a cold, unrelenting drizzle that soaked the fields and dulled the horizon. Grace stood on the edge of her property, boots caked in clay, eyes fixed on the skeletal outline of the old wooden pole rising from the heart of her field. In her hands, she held the folded American flag that had once hung over her grandfather's barn, a relic she hadn't touched in years. This morning, it meant something more. Sheriff Don Mercer had arrived not an hour earlier, his cruiser trailing a wake of mud down the drive. He emerged with a manila folder in hand, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he said, voice low, "but you need to know what you're up against." Inside the folder was a series of scanned contracts, loan agreements, easement permissions, and payment schedules, all tracing back to Sterling Horizons. 3 local banks had entered into exclusive agreements with the developer, providing fast-track approvals and preferential loan rates in exchange for targeted foreclosures. Grace's signature was among them, though she'd never signed any such document. "This is fraud," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Dawn nodded. "It is, but proving it in court's a whole other war." Back inside the house, Ethan and Mia were huddled around the dining table, laptops open, maps and old documents scattered like puzzle pieces. They had spent the last 2 days reconstructing the original hydrological model of the region, comparing geological surveys from 1950, 1965, and 1982. What they discovered chilled them. Every major water flow had been subtly altered. "They didn't just divert water," Ethan said, tapping a contour line on the 1965 map. "They rerouted history." Mia traced her finger along the path of a now-defunct irrigation canal. This valley was designed to feed farms like ours. Every adjustment they made pushed flow towards Sterling-owned properties. It was engineered scarcity. Outside, Grace mounted the soaked wooden pole with iron brackets, the flag now tied to its top. Rain streaked her cheeks as she raised it high. It snapped weakly in the wind, colors muted, but it stood. It stood. By noon, the act had gone viral. A local drone operator, passing overhead, caught footage of the flag being raised in the gray mist and shared it online. Within hours, farmers from nearby counties began arriving at Grace's gate. They came in pickups, on tractors, some still in mud-splattered overalls. Each carried stories of lost water, of droughts that didn't make sense, of pressure from banks to sell land they'd farmed for generations. Rachel Vaughn, already on site to follow up on her investigation, met them with cameras rolling. The footage she captured wasn't of protests or outrage. It was quieter, men and women standing in a line, hats in hand, nodding at the flag, waving above a patch of stubbornly dry earth. Blake Kavanaugh saw it too. From the confines of a boardroom lined with tinted windows and guarded smiles, he watched the coverage unfold. His lips tightened as he turned from the screen. "Reach out to them," he ordered, voice clipped. His aide hesitated. "Which ones?" "All of them. Quietly. Buy them off. Threaten if we must. But that woman, Grace Whitaker, she needs to disappear from this narrative." Over the next 2 days, Grace received 5 separate offers from anonymous investors, each disguised as a buyout for environmental redevelopment. One came with a non-disclosure agreement and a 7-figure check already written. Another included a thinly veiled threat about building code violations on her property. She tore each one in half and burned the pieces in the fireplace. "They're running scared," Ethan said. "They should be," Grace replied. That evening, under soft golden light filtering through the storm's retreating clouds, she addressed the small crowd that had gathered. No microphones, no stage, just the porch steps and the weight of truth. "They told me we were failing because we were old, because we couldn't keep up. But what they never expected was that we'd compare notes, that we'd talk to each other, that we'd rise up." Applause rippled across the field. "This flag doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to every single one of you who refused to be bought, who stayed when it would have been easier to sell. And I promise you, as long as it flies, I won't back down." It wasn't a politician's speech. It didn't need to be. It was more than enough. And in the distance, under the hush of clouds still heavy with rain, the land listened, quiet, cracked, but no longer alone. Rain clung to the corners of the farmhouse windows as the sun struggled to pierce through the gray Kansas sky. Grace Whitaker stood in her kitchen, her gaze fixed on the narrow road that curved past her fields. After everything, the sabotage, the threats, the slow erosion of trust in the systems meant to protect people like her, she had stopped expecting miracles. But this morning wasn't about hope. It was about resolution. The sound of tires crunching gravel jolted her attention. A dark sedan, with government plates, eased into the driveway, its windshield wipers clicking in slow rhythm. A tall, composed woman stepped out, briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable beneath the wide brim of her navy hat. She introduced herself as Audrey Chan, a senior legal advisor to Governor Grant. Without wasting time, Chan handed Grace an official envelope embossed with the state seal. Inside was a court-issued stay order, a temporary suspension of all active foreclosure proceedings involving agricultural properties in Riverbend County. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she read the document. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a pause, a breather from the storm. Meanwhile, inside the modest university lab where Ethan Callahan worked part-time as a research consultant, a sealed manila envelope had been slipped under his office door. There was no return address, only the word urgent in red ink. Inside, he found grainy schematics and partial invoices pointing to unregistered high-volume pumping systems buried beneath parcels acquired by Sterling Horizons. The scale of the setup stunned him. It wasn't just resource misallocation, it was full-blown environmental theft. Ethan contacted Mia, who had been combing through data logs and water flow anomalies, looking for a digital trail. She met him later that afternoon at an abandoned service shed near the back edge of the property, once part of the original irrigation infrastructure. With a handheld scanner and a ruggedized tablet, they uncovered magnetic field distortions coming from beneath the cracked concrete. Digging with a crowbar and a borrowed post-hole digger, Mia unearthed a weatherproof container, shielding several sensor nodes and fiber optic cables. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury a smart monitoring system without anyone's knowledge. "Who monitors a station like this and hides it?" Mia muttered, sweat and mud streaking her face. Ethan stared at the blinking green light on one of the nodes. Whoever it is, they weren't expecting it to be found. Back at the farmhouse, Grace and Rachel Vaughn took the opportunity to meet with Chan over coffee, their conversation weaving between legal procedure and personal history. But as the rain gave way to an eerie stillness outside, a low thudding sound broke the calm. A delivery van sped down the road before veering off, its tires kicking up gravel. Grace and Rachel exchanged glances. Suspicious, Rachel offered to follow the vehicle after they finished their meeting. As they stepped outside and climbed into Rachel's truck, the brake pedal felt strange beneath Grace's foot, mushier than usual. As she tested it, the pedal sank to the floor. Instinct kicked in. She pulled the truck into gear and gently steered into an empty patch of field. As they coasted to a halt, Grace stepped out and checked the undercarriage. A thin, clean slice had been made across the brake line, deliberate, surgical. Not rust, not wear and tear. They called Sheriff Mercer, who arrived within 20 minutes, stone-faced and concerned. "This ain't random," he said grimly. "Somebody's sending you a message, again." Later that evening, under floodlights hastily installed by concerned neighbors, Grace hosted a press conference right on her porch. Rachel stood beside her, camera rolling, while Audrey Chan observed quietly from the steps. The microphones carried Grace's voice across airwaves already buzzing with rumors. "My name is Grace Whitaker. I've lived on this land for over 40 years. My family has farmed it for 4 generations, and we've never faced anything like this. Not the drought, not the debts, not the storms. This is something different. This is theft dressed up in paperwork, lies stitched into contracts." She paused, letting the tension settle before continuing. "I don't speak just for myself. There are dozens of other families facing what I'm facing, being drained out, not by nature, but by design. And we've got proof. Now the question is, what will the people in power do about it?" Cameras clicked, and the video spread faster than expected. Within 24 hours, clips of Grace's speech circulated online, sparking public outrage. For the first time, people beyond Riverbend saw the scope of the betrayal. Inside a quiet office, high up in a Sterling Horizons tower, Blake Kavanaugh watched the footage, his jaw clenched. He picked up the phone and barked, "We move up phase 3. No more delays. The chessboard had shifted, and Grace, whether she had planned to or not, had just made her first decisive move. The wind was still when Grace stepped into the shadow of the old horse barn. Only the creak of the weathered door and the muffled crunch of her boots on the packed earth broke the silence. Mia and Ethan were behind her, flashlights in hand, eyes sharp with a mix of apprehension and resolve. What had begun as a hunch the previous night, based on vague blueprints tucked between decades-old ledgers, had now led them here, drawn to a forgotten structure that once housed livestock, now swallowed by decades of dust and disuse. They found the trapdoor beneath a false floor panel near the northwest corner, just where Mia's scanned schematics had suggested. Rusted hinges groaned in protest as they pried it open. A damp, musty breath of air rose from the opening, like an exhale from the past. "I'll go first," Ethan said, lowering himself onto the old wooden ladder, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Grace held her breath as he disappeared below, the silence between his steps stretching like wire. When his voice finally echoed up, calm and steady, it felt like a rope tugged loose in her chest. "It's safe, and you're going to want to see this." The space beneath the barn wasn't just a cellar. It was a sealed concrete room, 10 feet deep, its walls lined with metal filing cabinets, old conduit lines, and a desk bearing the State Water Resources seal from 1971. Dust blanketed everything, but the air was strangely cool, almost preserved. On one wall hung a wide blueprint that took up half the space, a detailed hydrogeological map of Kansas, hand-labeled and color-coded. "What is this place?" Mia whispered. Ethan ran a hand along the map, tracing lines that converged over Riverbend. "This is no cellar. It's a field operations node. This kind of setup was typical for Cold War-era infrastructure research, but it's been modified. Look at this, these red-marked corridors. They correspond to recent sensor readings near your well, Grace." Mia flipped open one of the filing drawers and extracted a hard drive sealed in plastic. The label read, "Hydronet, Prototype Logistics and Node Control." Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to Ethan. He looked at the label, then at them. "This isn't just about water mismanagement. This is a control system. Hydronet wasn't some minor project. It's a cross-state coordination grid. Whoever ran this didn't just divert water. They designed a framework to manipulate it across jurisdictional lines. The weight of it hit Grace like a silent thunderclap. They were trying to privatize water, not just here, everywhere. Ethan's fingers moved quickly over his portable decryptor, connecting the hard drive. Lines of code began scrolling. Inside was a series of documents, blueprints, and communications logs. One document was titled Asset Suppression Protocol, Riverbend Sector. Mia read aloud a portion of the screen. Targeted farms with legacy wells and unregulated groundwater access. Reclassify zones. Initiate psychological pressure through debt acceleration. Final acquisition strategy. Foreclosure. Grace clenched her fists. So it wasn't just sabotage, it was strategy. We were targets, all of us. Back above ground, Sheriff Don Mercer stood at the barn entrance, face pale. He had followed them on instinct, tipped off by Grace's cryptic message that morning. When Ethan showed him the files, Mercer didn't speak for a long while. Then, finally, his voice came low, grave. "I've seen that name before, Hydronet. It showed up in an envelope during my first term. No return address, no explanation. Just a disk and 2 maps. I brought it to the county commission. Blake Kavanaugh was already active back then. 2 days later, my office was broken into. I was told to drop it. I did. I'm sorry." Grace met his eyes. There was no anger, just a bone-deep weariness. Now's the time to pick it back up. That afternoon, Mercer stood before the press on the front steps of the sheriff's station, documents in hand, releasing everything he had once buried out of fear. As Rachel Vaughn captured the scene, live streaming to her ever-growing following, Governor Grant issued a temporary moratorium on all commercial development projects in the Riverbend region. Her statement was clear. Until we understand the full extent of systemic manipulation, no further permits will be issued. That night, Grace stood alone by the old barn. The moonlight bathed the field in pale silver. The wind was rising again. This time, not in warning, but in awakening. She thought of her grandfather's stories about the land, how it had provided for them in hard times, how it had always endured. Now it was her turn to fight not just for soil and crops, but for truth buried deep beneath the earth. And she was just getting started. The attic had always been off limits, not by decree, but by unspoken tradition. It was where Grace's mother had packed away trunks of old quilts, broken tools, and the past itself. But on that overcast morning, Mia had climbed the creaky stairs with a flashlight and a determination that hadn't let her sleep the night before. Something about the Hydronet files had haunted her. She needed to know more about the land, about her family, and maybe about secrets buried long before Blake Kavanaugh ever set foot in Riverbend. Behind a stack of dusty crates, she found a cedar box marked with her mother's maiden initials, GLW. Inside, among faded school awards and dried flower bouquets, was a journal, brown leather, cracked with age. She opened it slowly, pages filled with the crooked cursive of a child. The first entry was dated July 15th, 1987. Mia sat on the attic floor as thunder rumbled in the distance and began to read. The windmill stopped again. Mama said it's just the drought, but I saw water in the neighbor's fields. Grandpa yelled at the man in the brown suit. I think he took something from our shed. Mia's heart quickened. The entries continued sporadically, detailing events that mirrored the same water shortages they were facing now. Except these accounts came from the perspective of a 10-year-old girl, one who would grow up to become her mother. She flipped to a later page. Today they buried something near the horse barn. Grandpa told me to never dig there, no matter what. Mama cried after he left. I heard her say, "They won't take it from us again. I don't know what it is." When Mia emerged from the attic, the journal clutched in her arms. Grace was in the kitchen, brewing coffee. She looked up and froze. "Where did you find that?" "It was yours," Mia said softly. "You wrote about water disappearing, about people coming at night, about Grandpa hiding something." Grace took the journal, her fingers trembling over the worn edges. Memories flickered in her eyes, some painful, some still unresolved. "I had forgotten most of it," she admitted. "Or maybe I tried to. After my father passed, Mama warned me to never bring it up again. She said secrets only grow teeth when you feed them." Meanwhile, at Ethan's university lab, the professor stood before a massive digital display. A 3D model of the aquifer system beneath Riverbend rotated slowly, lit by color-coded veins and intersections. Years of water flow data had been compiled, stitched together from aerial imaging, geological surveys, and now the whistleblower's files. "This," Ethan said to the assembled team of federal hydrologists and policy aides, "is a living map. These tunnels and culverts aren't just natural formations, they're engineered corridors. The scale is staggering." He pointed at a series of nodes flashing in red. Each one coincides with a property that filed for bankruptcy between 1995 and 2020. Nearly all were later acquired by subsidiaries tied to Sterling Horizons. Back at the farm, Rachel Vaughn set up her mobile newsroom at the edge of a now infamous field, the same plot where the illegal pump system had been unearthed weeks earlier. This time, she wasn't alone. Men in plain uniforms, not local deputies, but federal agents, stood near the boundary, guarding the exposed infrastructure. Rachel went live. What began as a land dispute in Riverbend has spiraled into what federal sources now call the largest unauthorized water diversion operation in Kansas history. Behind me, federal agents are securing equipment that investigators believe siphoned water through concealed pipelines buried under farmlands owned by Sterling Horizons. She paused, camera zooming in on the exposed conduit snaking underground. And as evidence mounts, more voices are stepping forward. That evening, Grace received the letter, hand-delivered by a courier, sealed with the emblem of the U.S. House Committee on Environmental Oversight. Invitation to testify. Federal witness request. Grace Whitaker, Riverbend, Kansas. Topic: agricultural water manipulation and resource suppression. Date to be scheduled. Her hand tightened around the envelope. "They want me to testify," she whispered to Mia. Mia nodded. "You have to." As if summoned by fate itself, Ethan called. "Grace, you might want to sit down." She could hear the tension in his voice. "What is it?" "I just received an encrypted message from a contact inside Sterling. They're willing to talk. They were one of the lead engineers on Hydronet. Do they want immunity? I think they want redemption." Grace looked out the window. Rain had started again. Not the dry, useless kind that danced off chemically treated soil, but a real spring rain. She walked onto the porch, eyes scanning the edge of the field where she once played as a child. "Then let them speak," she said. "The soil is listening. So am I." The wind carried the smell of petrichor, and for a moment, the land felt alive again, as if it too remembered what had been taken. The hum of the plane was a low, constant drone as it cut through the Kansas morning sky. Grace sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the quilted fields far below. a patchwork of greens and browns that once meant stability and lineage, but now symbolized uncertainty and a battle for truth. Mia sat beside her, poring over a thick folder filled with data, maps, and annotated documents. Across the aisle, Ethan reviewed slides on a tablet, rehearsing the technical summary he'd been called to present. They weren't heading to court, but it felt like a trial, and the jury would be the state itself. To Grace, the Capitol was a fortress of polished stone and cold authority. Yet as she stepped into the echoing marble foyer, hand gripping Mia's shoulder for balance, she didn't feel small. She felt charged. The weight of everything they'd uncovered, every document, every hidden pump, every whispered threat. It all had a place now, and so did she. The hearing room was packed. Media crews clustered near the back, scribbling notes and readying lenses. Lawmakers lined the semicircular panel, flanked by environmental and legal advisors. At the center sat Governor Evelyn Grant and Secretary of Natural Resources Donna Bellamy, two women with power to shift the tide. Opposite Grace's table was a sharp contrast in posture and tone. Blake Kavanaugh sat upright, immaculate in a dark, tailored suit, his expression unreadable. On either side of him, attorneys whispered, shuffled papers, and made strategic eye contact with members of the panel. They were ready for a show. Governor Grant gavelled the room to order. This special session of the Kansas State Environmental Oversight Committee is convened to hear sworn testimony related to allegations of unlawful land development practices and aquifer tampering in Riverbend County. First came procedural statements. Then Kavanaugh's legal team offered their narrative. Sterling Horizons had brought growth, jobs, investment. The accusations were a campaign of hysteria from people unwilling to embrace change. One attorney referred to Grace's farm as an isolated anecdote blown out of proportion. Grace didn't flinch. When her name was called, she rose slowly and stepped to the podium, her boots echoing against the hardwood floor. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't need to. She told them about the dry wells, the data her daughter had brought home, the night someone sliced her brake lines, the old men who used to gather under the co-op awning and talk weather, now gone, foreclosed or defeated. She painted a picture so human, so painfully real, the room fell into a heavy, attentive silence. Then it was Ethan's turn. He laid out the hydrological inconsistencies. Maps from 1982 overlaid with current sensor data, showing exactly how the underground water flow had been redirected. He explained what no average farmer ever could, how misplaced pumps and missing county records weren't clerical errors. They were designed. Mia stepped forward next. Her voice was clear, sharpened by emotion and purpose. She displayed satellite imagery that showed green fields surrounding properties owned by Sterling, while others, like her mother's, turned to dust. Then she pulled up a side-by-side video of rainfall runoff, how water refused to penetrate the surface of Grace's land. "You can't fight what you can't see," she said. "But once you do, you can't look away." A murmur rose in the chamber. That's when Rachel Vaughn made her entrance. She didn't walk to the podium, she strode. In one hand, she held her press credentials. In the other, a small, black digital recorder. "Madam Governor," she said, "with permission, I'd like to enter new evidence into the record." The governor gave a nod. Rachel hit play. From the speakers came a chilling voice, Blake's. "If the reports don't match what we need, rewrite them. No one upstate is going to comb through soil density samples." Another voice, a county official, responded, "And the environmental impact study?" Blake's tone turned flat. "It's already been signed. Just make sure Whitaker doesn't show up again." No one moved. Blake's face went pale. One of his attorneys dropped a pen. After a few moments, the governor leaned forward. "Mr. Kavanaugh, would you care to respond to this recording?" I'm not aware of that conversation," Blake stammered. "That recording lacks context." "You'll have ample time to explain," the governor replied, in front of the attorney general. A brief recess followed. Behind the closed doors, the mood shifted. Grace sat at the edge of a long oak bench, staring at the folder in her lap, suddenly very aware that this wasn't just a defense, it was an indictment. When the hearing resumed, Governor Grant returned with gravity in her voice. In light of the testimony and corroborating evidence, I am authorizing the immediate formation of the Agricultural Water Preservation Commission, effective today." She turned toward Grace. "As of this moment, I am appointing Ms. Grace Whitaker as civilian advisor to the commission. She represents the backbone of Kansas agriculture, resilient, rooted in truth, and unwilling to surrender her land to fraud. She will advise this administration on all future water policy matters concerning independent farms." The chamber erupted. A standing ovation broke out in the media gallery. Even a few state senators stood, clapping not just for Grace, but for the truth that had finally surfaced. She blinked hard, then rose. Her throat tightened, but she managed a simple nod and a quiet thank you. Outside, the sky had cleared. Grace walked down the Capitol steps with Mia on one side and Ethan on the other. Reporters called her name. Flashes popped, but she didn't stop. As they reached the sidewalk, a young farmer approached and handed her a folded piece of paper. "Ma'am," he said, voice shaking, "that hearing, it gave me hope, for all of us." Grace smiled. "Then we're just getting started." Rain had fallen over Riverbend for nearly 3 days, soft and persistent. It wasn't the kind of rain that washed things away. It was the kind that soaked in, quietly and patiently, as if the land itself were listening. Grace Whitaker stood at the edge of the western field, just past sunrise, her boots half buried in the wet earth. For the first time in years, water pooled naturally at her feet. There was no humming of hidden pumps, no artificial runoff patterns, just the sound of a field breathing again. Across the state, headlines were screaming. Water fraud scandal rocks. Kansas development giant. CEO of Sterling Horizons arrested in land theft scheme. The Kansas State Attorney General's office, acting on the evidence gathered by Grace, Ethan, Mia, and the growing army of whistleblowers and investigative journalists, had issued arrest warrants for Blake Kavanaugh and 3 senior executives at Sterling Horizons. More shockingly, the state Supreme Court had nullified 42 land transfers across 5 counties, transactions that had been pushed through with fraudulent environmental reports and unlawful zoning manipulations. The morning Grace received the official call from the governor's office, she had just finished hanging the family's laundry. Her fingers froze on the damp fabric as she listened. "Mrs. Whitaker," the aide said, "we wanted you to know, before the news broke, the court ruled in your favor. Blake Kavanaugh has been taken into custody. And Grace, you won." But it didn't feel like a win, not immediately. The fight had been so long, so consuming, that victory didn't come with cheers, but with a silence that sank deep into her bones. Grace sat on the porch, staring out at the fields that generations before her had nurtured. That same afternoon, Ethan and Mia hosted a press conference at the Kansas State University's Department of Environmental Sciences. Together they unveiled an interactive, publicly accessible groundwater network map, the most detailed depiction of subterranean water routes in the state's history. "This isn't just about Grace's farm," Ethan said into the microphone, his voice steady but charged. "This is about transparency. Every citizen has the right to know where the water flows, who controls it, and why." Mia followed, displaying 3D overlays, color-coded zones of vulnerability, and the new sensor data installed on key parcels across the state. "We've identified 17 critical junctions, places like Riverbend, where the wrong hands could strangle agricultural regions. Today, they're protected." More than 70 farmers were contacted within 48 hours. Some cried when they were told they could reclaim their land. Others simply sat in stunned silence, too exhausted to feel. The governor's office announced immediate emergency relief funds and legal support to help farmers reintegrate. Blake's arrest sent ripples across the country. Sterling Horizon stock collapsed. Congressional leaders demanded oversight hearings on corporate land acquisition practices in drought-prone regions. Grace was invited to speak at the National Farmers Union Convention in Des Moines, Iowa. She stood on a stage before a sea of faces that looked like hers, weathered, determined, wary of hope. "I was told to be quiet, that my fight was small, that what happened to our family was just business." Her voice didn't tremble, it rang. "But land isn't just business. Water isn't just numbers on a ledger, and farmers aren't just placeholders in someone else's investment strategy. We're stewards, and it's time the world started listening. The room erupted, not just applause, stomping, cheering. People who hadn't clapped in years stood to their feet. That same day, a final announcement came from Washington. Riverbend, Kansas would become the pilot site for a new federally funded agricultural water conservation initiative. The town that had been quietly crushed under corporate boots was now the nation's blueprint for water ethics and restoration. As Grace returned home late that night, she pulled off her boots and walked barefoot across the porch. Mia was waiting, her laptop aglow. The farm's data feed was active. The aquifer readings had stabilized. Natural patterns had returned. "You know what day it is?" Mia asked, closing her screen. Grace paused. "It's been exactly 1 year since our well stopped working. And now it's back. We made it back." Grace didn't answer right away. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the barn. Its roof now gleamed with solar panels. Beyond that, the field stirred in the moonlight. "This isn't the end," she said softly. "It's just the last drop before everything changes." The dawn broke with a quiet dignity over Riverbend, casting golden light across fields that had, not long ago, stood on the brink of desolation. Now, the land breathed again, healed, humming with life, and laced with a kind of peace that comes only after a storm has passed. At the center of this rebirth stood a building that hadn't existed just 3 months prior, a single-story, cedar-paneled structure nestled among rows of revitalized sunflower stalks. Above its doors, in hand-carved letters, read the name that had come to symbolize a movement, the Grace Whitaker Center for Water and Soil Conservation. Inside, monitors flickered with real-time aquifer data, soil temperature readings, and regional drought predictions. Archival maps lined the walls, annotated by students and hydrologists alike. Mia, now a full-time researcher affiliated with the Kansas Environmental Sciences Fellowship, moved gracefully between workstations, calibrating sensors and annotating data logs with a calm precision that mirrored her mother's strength. "This used to be the hay barn," she said quietly, glancing at Ethan, who leaned against a table, arms crossed over his chest. He smiled. "Now it's a beacon. This center is going to change everything, Mia. And you're the reason it's not just a story in a textbook." She said nothing, but her eyes shimmered with the emotion of knowing this wasn't just a research post. It was a vow to the land, to her family, to truth. Outside, rows of new groundwater sensors, built with federal grant support, blinked green, indicating healthy recharge. Each sensor had been installed at a critical hydrological junction across Riverbend, mapping water flow and flagging abnormalities in real time. The entire region was now under community oversight, with open access data feeds streaming live to phones and tablets across 5 counties. As the first sunlight bathed the center in a warm glow, guests began arriving for the inaugural Conservation Symposium. Farmers, academics, state officials, and even tribal water protectors from the Arkansas Basin took their seats beneath a massive white canopy strung up behind the house. Rows of folding chairs had been set in the same soil that had once cracked and crumbled from hidden theft. Now, it held the weight of a revolution. Grace stepped up to the podium without a script. She didn't need one. "There was a time when my voice didn't count, when I thought that if you came from a small place, the big ones could walk right over you," she said, her voice steady but thick with memory. "But I learned something standing on this land, through the drought, through the hearings, through the lies. When truth lives in the soil, you just have to uncover it." She paused, her eyes drifting to the back row, where Lily sat between Mia and Sheriff Mercer. The little girl clutched a packet of seeds in her small hands, fidgeting with curiosity. "We were told we had no power," Grace continued, "but the ground knew better, and now, so do we." Applause thundered, but Grace didn't linger on the praise. She walked through the crowd and toward the edge of the field, where the old windmill stood sentinel. Lily raced up to meet her. "Grandma," she said, her eyes wide and expectant, "can I plant them now?" Grace knelt beside her, guiding the child's hands into the freshly tilled earth. Together, they pressed sunflower seeds, heirlooms passed from hand to hand since Grace's great-grandmother had tilled the land in canvas gloves and Depression-era boots, into the moist soil. "Will they grow this year?" Lily asked, glancing up. They'll grow stronger than ever, Grace whispered, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. Because now, nothing and no one can steal their water again. Cameras clicked softly from a respectful distance, but no one interfered. This moment wasn't for the headlines, it was for the soil, for the lineage, for the unbroken promise between one generation and the next. In the coming weeks, the Whitaker Center would launch programs for local students to monitor their own wells, train young farmers in regenerative practices, and host data sharing events between rural communities. University partnerships had already blossomed, with Mia co-leading a project to design predictive drought models based on real-time sensor data. But on this day, it wasn't technology or policy that mattered most. It was a child and her grandmother planting hope, seed by seed, on ground that had once been stolen and silenced. As the wind rustled the sunflowers overhead and the crowd slowly dispersed into small circles of conversation and community planning, Grace stood once more beside her family. Her eyes scanned the horizon, where sky met earth in the familiar curve of home. Riverbend was no longer just a dot on a map. It had become the starting point of something bigger, a national movement rooted not in protest, but in persistence, not in politics, but in principle. And somewhere beneath the surface, in soil long denied and now reborn, the future had already begun to bloom. If this story moved you, if something inside you stirred while watching Grace Whitaker fight not just for her land, but for the truth buried beneath it, then I hope you'll take a moment right now and leave a comment below. Tell us, what does your land mean to you? What have you had to protect when no one else believed you could? Because for us, this isn't just a story, it's a mirror. Somewhere out there, there's a family quietly holding on to the last acres of a generational farm. Somewhere, a daughter like Mia is trying to make sense of soil samples and secrets. Somewhere, a mother like Grace is standing on a porch at dawn, wondering if anyone will hear her if she shouts into the wind. And maybe, just maybe, you are that person. Here on this channel, we don't just tell farmer stories. We uncover buried histories. We lift the voices of those who've been silenced too long. We dig deeper because we believe the roots of America aren't found in skyscrapers or speeches, but in soil, seed, sweat, and stubborn love. So if this journey through Riverbend meant something to you, if Grace's quiet defiance made you feel a little stronger, or if Mia's fierce drive reminded you of someone you love, please don't let it end here. Drop a comment and let us know which moment hit hardest for you. Was it the courtroom testimony, the flag raised in the rain, the whispered warning over the landline, or that final scene, Grace and her granddaughter pressing sunflower seeds into healing soil? Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, because the next story we tell may be even closer to home than you think, and turn on that bell icon. Because soon, we'll be traveling to a windswept ridge in Montana, to an abandoned cattle ranch in Texas, to a blueberry field in Maine where something hidden in an old shipping container might just rewrite Cold War history. Every day, we bring you real, raw, emotionally charged stories from farms, fields, and forgotten places. Stories about ordinary people who uncover the extraordinary because they dared to dig deeper. And we're not slowing down, not now, not ever. Because if Grace taught us anything, it's this. You don't need power to speak. You just need the courage to keep going when the world tells you to stop. You are part of this journey now. We see you, we hear you, and we're so glad you're here. We'll see you in the next story.